Hey there, Blockheads. Taylor Martin, Director of Pewaukee Lake Sailing School. We're here in Pewaukee, Wisconsin with a laser this time. I'm going to take a walk through like we do with the rest of our boats, just to look at parts and pieces that can go wrong on the water that you should double check before you go sailing. So, starting at the bow up here, the really big part that you want to double check is that your bungee for your dagger board is not wearing through anywhere where it chafes with the bow eye up here. And as you're checking the bungee, really double check that these knots are in place with your sister clips here that attach to the dagger board. Knots don't like to stay in bungee, so really anywhere where you have bungee on your boat, you want to double check that those knots are still solid. Speaking of knots, pretty simple boat the laser is, but our Cunningham Vang outhaul setup here have a lot of knots tied in them. And because they're all low clearance knots and tend to be bowlines, they're at risk for capsizing. And fortunately, if you're a laser sailor, you are touching all the parts of your boat as you rig up, especially this assembly, which you generally have to untangle before you go out. But double check knots that you're not tying day to day in this Cunningham and in this Vang assembly to make sure, especially because they are those low clearance knots, that they're not at risk for capsizing. Have a couple of different types of knots that you can tie that aren't bowlines. You have the skiff knot, which is good, just an overhand on an overhand. And that one tends not to capsize as much as those bowlines that are tied really tight. On this setup up here, we got a lot of moving parts. Really our big things that we want to check is those rings on our pins and rings, where anytime we have those, that they are not opened at all. We got a lot of small line that can snag in those rings or run through those rings and pry them open. If those pop out while you're sailing, this is the biggest moving part on your boat, and if you lose a ring, you lose all of it. You also want to double check anywhere where you have rivets on the mast. Again, pieces you're not interacting with that much day to day, that these rivets, like with our 420s and our Optis and any other place we have rivets, are still attached to the boat, are not flared out at all, are not loose in there. And we have a rivet all the way up the mast that you want to check that doesn't get checked that often, but making sure when you're assembling your boat that you're checking to make sure those rivets are not popping out. The mast does bend a lot and undergo a lot of load. The last couple of things here, we have a lot of blocks on this setup, and so if you're sailing in a sandy or a saltwater environment, make sure that you're A, rinsing those blocks out every time, and B, checking to make sure that those blocks are still frictionless, that they're still able to turn freely, lubricating them and cleaning them as appropriate. As we move back here, we have our 2 deck cleats, and again, this is pretty simple, all one assembly here, so you just have to check where the machine screws go through the hull to make sure that they're still attached, and again, that these cam cleats aren't blown out, that spring is still good, that those bearings in there are still good to turn. As we move back, we have all of the bungee and all of the line for the hiking straps, making sure that your hiking strap is still tied in, and again, bungee wears out pretty quickly. There's a lot of friction between the bungee, the hiking strap, and the cleat for the bridle back here, so double checking anywhere where that bungee is chafing that it's not wearing out. So at the back of the boat here, we got a couple of things on the outhaul that we want to check. Again, anytime that we have a knot tied that we're not untying and tying every day, you want to double check that that's still good to go. You also want to make sure that your bungee, your return bungee for your outhaul, isn't worn out, just like you would anytime you have bungee on the boat. And then finally, our clue strap back here is just Velcro most of the time. And so anytime this Velcro is wearing out, which it does very quickly in salt and in sand, you want to replace that. Make sure that your Velcro is going to hold when you're on the water. Back at the back of the boat here, anytime we have these plastic fittings like we do on the outhaul or like the gudgeons on your boat, these fittings are more subject to breaking than their metal counterparts. And so you want to make sure that you're not seeing any cracks or any fatigue in those fittings. And then again, like we do with our Opti and our 420, making sure that that rudder hold down clip is still good to go. Last couple of things in the boat here, we have our plugs. We have one plug in the cockpit for our auto bailer, which is rubber. And you want to make sure that that rubber is not cracking. And if those plugs crack out, then you don't have an auto bailer plug. And our plug at the back here, again, making sure that our plug is seated in the boat and that anytime we have a gasket like we do on this plug, that gasket isn't cracked out. And other than that, give a once over to your boat before you get on the water. And thanks for watching, Blockheads.